Hi, my name is Juliet Selgren, and this is my podcast, The Great Antidote. This podcast has been brought to you by the Center for Growth and Opportunity at Utah State University. To learn more, visit www.thecgo.org. Welcome back. Today, I'm happy to be speaking to Nick Gillespie, editor-at-large at Reason Magazine. Before that, he was the editor-in-chief of Reason Magazine from 2000 to 2008, and then editor-in-chief of Reason.com and Reason TV from 2008 to 2017. Nick originally joined Reason's staff in 1993. He's the author of several books, including The Declaration of Independence. Independence, not Independence, a book he co-wrote with Matt Welsh. He's also a giant in the libertarian movement, so I'm super excited to talk to him today. Welcome, Nick.
Hey, Juliet. It's very good to be talking with you.
So, before we get started, what is the most important thing that people my age or in my generation should know that we don't?
Boy, I hesitate to make any kind of suggestions about that, but I think the most important thing for everybody always to realize is that the world existed long before you did, and to be excited by that fact rather than annoyed by it. And it's always important to read history, not just of like long ago days, but from 25 years ago or 30 years ago. And many of the things that I think Gen Z and younger millennials are facing are things that, were being dealt with, a generation ago. So always read your recent history as well as your ancient history.
I have found that to be true. I'll be reading things and thinking, oh, well, it feels like they're going through the exact same thing that we're all going through now, except it's like different, but it's the same sort of reaction. And no, I think you're totally right. And I try to do that. I struggle a little bit, but that's good advice. Okay.
I find it very comforting to know that, the thoughts that I have are not, I guess first the problems that I face are not original to me. And the thoughts that I have are not particularly original. The past is like this giant attic that you can rummage through and basically find everything that you need is already up there. And you just have to kind of dust it off and figure out how to use it in the current day.
Yeah, I think I kind of first found that idea when I was reading, what is this book called? I was reading Anathem by, I don't even remember what the author's name is. I probably should. It's like one of my favorite books, but that's okay. And there's this group of people called the Lorites, and their entire job is to basically, if someone comes up with a new idea, to be like, no, actually, that's not a new idea. Someone already came up with that. And then I started thinking, well, not nothing that I think of, but nothing that I am facing. No problem is entirely new. There's at least some aspect that has already been dealt with by other people at another time. And
Right.
it is very comforting.
Good.
Okay, so before we jump into your book, I want to ask you about your career before Reason. So you've done a bunch of things. You worked for Teen Machine magazine, where you
That's right.
interviewed celebrities, and you ghost wrote an advice column for Alyssa Milano, which, I don't know, that sounds so cool, but I was trying to find evidence of this,
Yes.
and I couldn't find it. And so I was looking at the stuff she's writing today, or her or someone else, and I have to say, I was not too impressed. What sort of stuff were you writing for her at that time?
So, and I'll rush to say that I never actually met her or have interacted with her in any way. But this was in the late '80s, and she was on a TV show called Who's the Boss, where she was the daughter of a character who worked for another character in the show. And it was an advice column. It was like people, girls would write in and say, I think that this boy likes me. What should I do? My parents fight a lot. What should I do? That type of stuff. And so, it was just a basic, generic,
Keep going, girl.
kids.
You got it.
It was a lot of that, and it was like, you believe in yourself. Be good to yourself, be good to others, and good things will follow. That type of stuff.
So not exactly the sort of stuff you're writing at Reason.
I don't know. It's not all different, but I did that and worked for a bunch of music and movie magazines for a few years after I had graduated college. And then I went to graduate school for English literature, creative writing, and eventually for a PhD in American literature. That was extremely helpful to me, both to have worked. I worked for about 3 years after graduating college and then going back to grad school. And it was really in the going back to grad school that I was ready to really learn a lot about a particular subject, literary analysis, cultural studies, things like that. And then when I was going to grad school, I applied for a job at Reason, which I had been reading since I was in high school, and got that and started my career at Reason.
Yay, Reason.
Mm,
So,
yes.
about Reason, I
Hmm.
asked Matt this when he was on a few weeks ago. So, Reason's slogan is free minds and free markets. What is your take on that?
It's so Reason was founded in 1968, and it was by a guy who was into Ayn Rand, as well as lots of other stuff. And the way I always read free minds and free markets was that it's kind of the idea that economic freedom and individual freedom and kind of economic liberty and civil liberties are conjoined. And that if you want to have a kind of good system for creating a world that makes sense and that allows people to do most of what they want, to become whoever they want, to sell whatever they want, you need to be a free thinker. You need to be willing to entertain almost any idea, but you also need to be in a system that allows you to to make money and then kind of spend it on what you want. And when you have one of those things but not the other, you get into a lot of trouble. And so, if you have some economic freedom and are able to make money, but then can't spend it on the things you want, you're going to be very frustrated. If you can think about stuff and kind of be free in the mind, but you're not really allowed to, buy and sell the types of things you're interested in, that's also frustrating. And so, it seems to me it's an aspiration to have a libertarian society where individuals are, given the most amount of kind of autonomy and space to think and live however they want to.
That makes sense. So, it's kind of about consistency. And I think about
Mm-hmm.
that a good amount where I'm like, I feel like everything that I think is it's centered around a principle almost, just the idea of freedom. And that seems to me more consistent than the things that other people are basing their beliefs on just because it's the same in like across the board, like in terms of like fiscal policy, but also like social policy.
Right.
All it's all the same. I don't know. But
Yeah, well,
um,
and when you think about it, it's libertarians tend to really prioritize kind of consistency of thought, or at least we try to. And but part of it is like, what kind of world is it if if you're free to run the type of business you want, but then you're not allowed to marry the person that you're in love with, or you know, you may not want to, you may not like drinking alcohol, but you like smoking pot. But one of these things is going to, is sanctioned and is allowed, and the other is going to have you sent to jail. Let's try to make things more consistent across the board, because then people can, live their lives with a minimum of interference. But I think it's also important, in the free minds part, to constantly interrogating your premises and to be making sure that the reason why you're doing things makes sense, that it's not just, you happen to feel this way, especially maybe even less when it's involving yourself, and when it is when you're talking about restraining other people from being able to do what they want to do.
Yeah, in the book, The Declaration of Independence, it talks about this kind of, it says, I think like the exact words were something like, it's a pre-political impulse.
Hmm.
And I think that just describes exactly the way I've always felt about it,
Mm-hmm.
but I could never really describe. What's the difference between big L libertarian and small L libertarian?
Well, I think, big L libertarian means somebody who is a member of the Libertarian Party, which is a political organization that is, trying to elect people to office. So in the same way, you can be a small D Democrat or a big D Democrat, meaning that you believe in representative government and, more or less that majority rules. You can also be a Republican with a small R, where you believe in representative government, but that certain things cannot be put up to a vote, or you can be a capital R. And, there's always some difference when it comes to libertarians. A capital L libertarian is a member of the Libertarian Party, and you're trying to act in, elections and stuff like that to get your preferred candidates put into office and all of that. I think a small L libertarian is somebody, and that's what I consider myself. I'm not a member of the Libertarian Party, although I always end up voting for them when they're around in an election if I'm voting. But a small L, the way I define it is kind of, it's an attitude, it's a predisposition, it's kind of a temperament that I always want, I want individuals, or I want people to be able to make more choices in their life, to have more options in front of them rather than fewer. There are cases where, where politics or reality means you're not going to allow people to do anything that they want in any circumstance. But the kind of, the starting point is, that people should be basically allowed to live however they want, unless somebody can make a really strong case that allowing that is going to cause all kinds of problems.
That makes sense. Okay. Thank you.
All right.
Let's talk about the book now. I mean, I kind of mentioned it before. You talk a lot about the increased amount of freedom and choices that people have in their non-political lives, and how that betters their lives as a result. And this doesn't necessarily relate to specific policy or anything like that.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So, and it's funny because that book came out about a decade ago. So, in some ways, the specific examples are dated, but I think the general ideas that we're talking about in that are still hold up. But, take, for instance, and again, this is why knowing history a little bit is helpful. It fleshes out your vision of the world. But, 20 years ago, Starbucks was just kind of beginning to become like a major kind of chain. And before that, and it wasn't that there were laws against it or that you couldn't have good coffee and coffee drinks of all kinds of different types, with sugar and milk and cream and ice and or hot or whatever. It's just that there wasn't much of a market for it. And then the people behind Starbucks really started coming up with ways that here were different types of coffee they were offering, different types of drinks. You can personalize everything, where you get, 2 shots of caramel sauce or one or none. You get black coffee or you get coffee with whipped cream in it, all of this kind of stuff. I would argue, that, in being able to go into a place and order, from 1,000 or 10,000 different possible options off of a menu, you're given more choice and you're able to enjoy more things. You're able to try out new ideas. You're able to try out new tastes and flavors and dishes and things like that. And that's an increase in freedom. That might seem like a kind of banal one or, a trivial one, but it holds up for a lot of different things, including like, how do you live your life? It used to be, if you go back 50 years or 100 years ago, if you were a woman, for instance, or if you were black, you did not have the same number of options that you have now. Certain things, either because of laws or because of customs and, received tradition, women just weren't allowed to do certain types of things. you know, more recently, a lot of things have opened up that weren't open before, giving people more choices. And that's, kind of, the starting point. And in most parts of our lives, when you think about things like food, when you think about things like jobs and, working hours and working conditions, people over time have become much more able to kind of determine where they want to work and how they want to work. Whereas before, a lot of that stuff was kind of forced on them. Those are a lot of big changes. And some of these changes come specifically because of political action. A lot of the ways in which, say, blacks and women have advanced was because of political arguments to change particular laws to allow more people to participate more fully in parts of life. But a lot of it is also just that people change their mind and people loosen up things, or people innovate and come up with new ideas. And, like Starbucks, or, like Whole Foods markets and stuff like that, just where suddenly you're able to, access a whole wide range of behaviors or activities or commodities that you never would have thought to even try before.
And that's kind of what the book is about in a way.
Mm-hmm.
It's about calling out people and telling them to chill out and to put politics on the back burner and to kind of focus on, I don't know, living your life and having those choices for yourself.
Right.
And
And it's, one of the things that we, was the starting point for the book was that Matt and I had recognized, in our lifetime, and we were both, born in the 1960s, and just in our lifetime, things had become much less kind of stuffy or stuck up in most parts of our lives. People were able to wear their hair different ways. People were able to dress differently. People were able to talk differently and just kind of look differently. Everything became looser. But when and everything, there were more and more choices, and what to watch on TV, what to wear, where to work, how to live. But when you get to politics, you're still stuck with basically two choices, the Republican and the Democrat, or a conservative and a liberal. And, why was that? And how can we bring the amount of choice and individualization and personalization that's in all other parts of our lives? How can we bring that to bear to politics?
And there has been a rise of a more independent class of voters that don't necessarily identify with either side.
Yes.
Can you talk about the connection that exists between more choices, more freedoms in terms of like where you go to eat, what you wear, all that stuff, and the rise of this more independent group of people?
Yeah, and again, here, history is helpful in, it used to be that, or if you think about political parties as kind of package bundles, and I mean, everybody now is kind of cutting their cord, so you don't worry about a cable package in the way that you used to. But it would be, you would pay, $100 a month or something for a cable package, and in order to get 3 or 4 channels that you really want, you would have to buy the whole package. And people kind of got fed up with that. Or, on a record album, I grew up in a period when the typical way to buy music was to buy an LP, an album, that cost maybe $10 or $12, and it might have 2 or 3 songs on it that you really liked. By the time of Apple Music and iTunes and other forms where you would just buy individual songs, like you didn't have to spend $12 in order to get $3 worth of music you wanted. You would just buy the music you wanted, or you would find it, online for free and things like that. So, there was this move from having to take package deals where you had to take a lot of stuff you didn't want in order to get the things that you did. That's kind of how political parties operate. So, if you're a Republican, say, or something, or rather, let's say you want low taxes, you're in favor of low taxes. In order to get low taxes, like, you had to buy a bundle by voting for a Republican or somebody who would call themselves a conservative, but that would also mean you had to be anti-abortion and you had to be in favor of a big military. Like, you can't you can't kind of strip out the one thing that you really want and just vote for that. And on the Democratic side or the liberal side, it might be that, I'm in favor of abortion rights or reproductive freedom. But in order to do that, I have to buy with my vote a party that is super in favor of high taxes and unions or something like that. And it's like, no, these issues have nothing to do with one another. Why should I have to take that package rather than voting for the things that I want? And I think one of the things that we were talking about in the book is the idea that as people realize that bundles are oftentimes a bad deal, it means that people are trying to get rid of stuff that they can't sell otherwise. As we debundle all sorts of things in other parts of our lives, it will eventually come to a place where maybe we start doing that in politics. And instead of having laws or parties that cover so many aspects of our lives, we instead shrink what politics is about to fewer and fewer issues, so that we can vote on those more independently rather than having to, vote for somebody we agree with on one thing, but then have to put up with 5 or 6 or a dozen things that we actually either don't care about or are actually against.
That's a very good way to explain it, except I would say me and a lot of other people my
Mm-hmm.
age have started buying records, and so that's a thing
Yes.
now.
No, well, this is there. It's true. That's a good point. And it's also because, an album or, like a whole record, LP stands for long playing. And, it might have an hour's worth of music on it or, 45 minutes worth of music. And it also allows, in the same way that a novel allows a writer to, produce a different effect than a short story. That was one of the selling points of albums, was that it was more of a deeper, richer artistic statement.
I think that is why I like albums.
Mm-hmm.
I've started listening to things all the way through instead of pressing shuffle, and I've realized that the
Right.
shuffle button is fooling me. Like that's not no, that's wrong. It's not
Well,
wrong. It's
but
not
it's
wrong. I just
yeah.
prefer listening to an album in order because the artist said it should be that way, and that
Right,
is
but you also don't want to take the artist too seriously, right? Or rather, and this now goes back more into my kind of literary studies background. But like the author obviously intended something, but as a reader, as a consumer, you don't have to put up with what the author intended, because when you listen to something or you read something or you consume something, you make it your own. And I can remember there was, some of my favorite musical artists, and say, so somebody like Bob Dylan, who is, one of the great figures in the past 60 years of American popular culture. He has a great album called Blood on the Tracks. And there's one song in particular on it that I hate, that's like 6 minutes long. And whenever I would play the album, I'd play the first side, I'd turn it over, put on the second side, and then I'd have to wait, and I would pick up the record needle and skip it over that one track that I don't like, and again, that's subjective, right? But it's like,
yeah.
it's my experience. I can do this. And when CDs came out, one of the things that CDs allowed, it was still an album and you were buying the whole thing, but you could program the tracks. So like you could program a record, a CD album, and you could skip over stuff, or you could put the songs in whatever order you wanted, which was kind of empowering. And then eventually, of course, when you get to MP3s, you can now just create your own playlist. And something like Spotify, I mean, think about this too. This is like, the type of innovation that gives the end user, the consumer, the individual more power, is that when you go to Spotify, instead of listening on the radio for songs, that are just kind of floating by and maybe you'll hear the song you want, Spotify allows you to create a playlist, and you can take all the music that is out there, all the music you like, and you can create your own playlist. You can create your own album, out of everything that's out there. And that's kind of cool and interesting. Having said all of that, I do agree that there's real pleasure, when you like an artist and you go by their vision and by what they say. No, these are the songs that go together in this order. that's also kind of brilliant.
Yeah, I get that. The other day, I was like listening to the radio and some random song came on, and I was like, this is awful. I'm not a fan of this. And
Hmm.
I was thinking how crazy it must have been. Now, I guess it wasn't crazy until you're me and you've never had to deal with not having control over what you're
Yeah.
listening to. But it's so foreign to me, the idea of not having control over what I'm listening to. Like,
Right.
someone else is completely in control of what's playing on the radio, and all I can do is turn it off or change the channel to something else where I don't have any sort of control over that either. So
That
it's
was a huge shift in kind of American culture, but in global culture really, where and it might even be something like and a lot of this was technology. It was technologically driven, but I always used to think about. I really liked watching the Charlie Brown Christmas special, but it would be on once a year. And it was like if you didn't have TV Guide or like it was hard to get information about when stuff was going to be on TV and on what channel at what time on what day. You could you could be waiting the whole year to see a Charlie Brown Christmas special, and for some reason, if you weren't sitting in front of the TV when the station that played it broadcasted, you had to wait another year. And later, and by the time I had my own kids and stuff like that, and this stuff was available first on VHS tapes, and then on DVDs, and now it's on streaming services. You can watch it whenever you want, and you can even chop it up and like record it and play it back and do all kinds of modifications to it. That's hugely empowering, and I think that's happening in all kinds of aspects of our lives where we have much more control and much more power of what we consume, when we consume it, how we produce things, etc. And it's great. And it doesn't mean that we should that the if you find an artist, or if you find a singer, if you find a chef, if you find a store that is curating the types of things you like to buy, you want to go to that place and kind of learn from them. But the relationship is much more equal. It's no longer somebody who's just telling you this is what it is and you better like it. It becomes much more collaborative, and that's a great place to be, where everybody has more say about what goes on in their life.
it's like how my friend chooses to start listening to Christmas music in October, and
Yes, and it can be
I
very annoying, right? Because we're all different and we all have different tastes.
yeah, but also, I mean, you write about this in the book, but voters have been doing this. They've been kind of making their
Hmm.
own choices by being independents. Um,
Hmm.
how do we stand now on the independence front? And what is, I don't know, what is the connection between like libertarians and independent voters? Because they're not
Hmm.
always, there's not always an overlap. I mean, they're
That's right.
all independents, but some of them are libertarians, some of them are not.
Yeah,
Um,
and what I think it comes down to is, and this is something when we looked at early polls that study what's called voter self identification. Polling places like Gallup would call up people and say, do you, regardless of how you're registered, do you tend to vote for Republicans or Democrats, or are you independent? And in the early 70s, it was like almost 50% of people said they said they identified as a Democrat. And, it might have been in the high 30s or low 40s that identified as Republican. When you look now, and this has been declining ever since, but now it's like about, in the most recent Gallup poll, it was something like 25% of people said they considered themselves Republican, about 30% considered themselves Democrat, and the rest were independent. And the independents have been the single largest group, for a couple of decades now. And I think, and this is what we argue in the book, it's because the Republican bundle and the Democratic bundle represent, it's less and less appealing to more and more people for some of the reasons, that I talked about in the past, where it's like it may have made sense that, three or four different policy positions went together. Low taxes, a big army, that a big military, and reverence for the American flag. Like those all made sense. There aren't that many people who, that if you're doing a Venn diagram that fit into either of these parties anymore. And so they're kind of politically homeless. And I think one of the things, the connection, and that's not going to end anytime soon because the parties have become more and more extreme versions of themselves. So the Republican Party is much more conservative in a very narrow and cramped way than it used to be. The Democratic Party is much more kind of liberal or progressive in a way that it wasn't 50 years ago. So they're going to appeal to fewer and fewer people. How does that group of independents and libertarians fit in? You're right. They are not exactly the same thing. But there is one of the connections is that generally speaking, people in America are increasingly kind of socially tolerant. They really don't care about, things like homosexuality or race, when it comes to who is their neighbor, who should you be allowed to marry, these types of things. People are much more looser about social life, and they don't think that the government should be forcing rules on people in order to live a certain way. And a large number of Americans are also fiscally conservative, or fiscally responsible, meaning that they think the government should be, spending less money and doing fewer things. And in that sense, there's a large overlap, I think, between a kind of libertarian sensibility and this growing group of independent voters.
At the time of the publication of the paper edition,
Mm-hmm.
I'm a fan of paper editions. I personally don't
Sure.
like hardback books. They're
By the
just
way, if I may, and this is why history is fascinating, the creation of the paperback book, which was vastly cheaper. These started coming up in the 20th century in the like 30s and 40s, and especially after World War II. But paperback books were much cheaper, meaning that more people could read them and afford them. And that was like a technological innovation, that a couple of businesses, publishers figured out, what, we can publish paperback books that are cheap and are very, and then more people will buy them and we'll make less money on each book, but we'll sell more. So we do well. And then suddenly the masses were able to access books in a way that, a paperback book is very expensive, or rather a hardcover book is very expensive. A paperback is cheaper. And suddenly you change, the flow of information in the same way that the internet suddenly made, massive amounts of information readily available to people who otherwise had no idea, what was out there.
That's beautiful. I feel like that justifies my I will not I don't want to read a book that's hardback. I will not. I just no.
Well, you
Absolutely
might
not.
find, that at some point you find a book that you particularly, love, and you're going to read it over and over again, and a hardcover book lasts longer.
Yeah.
So,
It's good that that brought it to the masses. That makes me feel it just has this new level of beauty, I guess. I don't know if
hmm
you can call that
and
beautiful.
it
I
was
would
it
call it
was it
beautiful.
was very it was kind of controversial. Paperback books sometimes, paperback editions were considered inherently inferior, because they were cheap and disposable. And sometimes books that, the novels that were published as paperbacks were kind of smutty, a little bit dirty or racy and things like that. But again, it just massively expanded, what was available to people. And, this is one of the things, and to go back to this, to harp on the idea of history and whatnot, at every point, in the past 100 years or in the past 200 years, 250 years, people have been more free. They've been wealthier. They've had more stuff and more choices to make in their lives. But, it's always good to remember what it was like 25 years ago, 50 years ago, not so that you feel complacent about where you are now, but so that you understand like the goal is always to be giving people more stuff for the same amount of money or less. And it's really, it's exciting to me I'm in my 50s, and just the amount of stuff that I have access to. under the conditions that I want. Like I can watch TV, I can watch the shows that I want from the past, from the present, almost from the future, in a way that was unimaginable when I was a kid. And, what's the next thing that should be like that, where you have more and more options to do things the way you want? That's like a great world.
It does make me think about all the stuff that I'm using now, like phone,
Mm-hmm.
computer,
Yeah.
anything, microphone, earbuds, whatever. How is that going to change? Because
Yep.
if books can change so much that paperback books are normal now, then what's going to be new? I'm
Yeah.
excited for that then.
It is. It's a reason to get up in the morning. It's also a reason to think about, how can you contribute to that, either by creating content, which you're obviously doing, or creating the next medium, in which content gets distributed. It's fascinating. The people who created, say, like Twitter or something like that. It didn't come at the expense of anything else. They didn't say, okay, we only have 100 units of internet time or internet space, and we're taking this old stuff and we're using it for Twitter now. They just created a whole new space and a whole new world where people can interact and communicate. Some people would say, oh, this was a waste of time, or this is bad. TV was vilified when it came out as a waste of time. And it's like radio is better. Radio was vilified when it came out. And people would say, maybe movies were okay, but then people hated movies. And you go all the way back. And one of the lessons of history is that everything new, as it becomes popular, is made fun of, it's vilified, it's considered stupid and bad for you, it's unhealthy. And the novel, which only emerged as a form, and now it's considered like a high class arty thing, when it really emerged as a popular form in the 1800s, in the early 1800s, it was, people in charge who felt threatened by it were terrified that people would read these books and become sickly, or they would act poorly. It was kind of the way people talk about sometimes, something like rap music or violent movies or stuff like that. The same arguments that were made against rap music in the 90s were made against novels in the 1790s.
And I don't know, that made me think of Deirdre McCloskey and how
Mm-hmm.
that's how people thought about innovation. Innovation was
Absolutely.
this awful thing. And then, boom, no, it's not. It's cool
We
now.
always do that. We always do. People talk about Facebook is evil. Cell phones. You have bad posture. You're growing horns in the back of your head because you're constantly on your phones. Nobody pays attention anymore. We have short attention spans. Et cetera. Fear of innovation is not something that only took place in the past. It's everywhere around us. And again, that doesn't mean that everything new is good, but whenever people start to say, I dislike this because it makes me uncomfortable, it's new, it's different, a lot of times people seek to ban that type of thing, or to heavily restrict it and say only rich people can do it, only educated people can do it, only smart people can do it. That they're participating in a very old tradition, and one that is almost always wrong.
So back to the paperback book thing.
Mm-hmm.
So that came out a year after the original came out,
Yes.
and there's a new forward in this one. And it was about how everyone who read the book was impressed with the optimism expressed. And George Will called you, quote, incurably upbeat journalists, end quote. And other
Mm-hmm.
people called you out of touch. And you admit that you were hoping that in 2012
Mm-hmm.
you would be further along in the quest to kick
Yeah.
government out of the bedroom and out of the boardroom. And
Right.
now I assume that feeling has only gotten worse.
Yeah, yeah, it is difficult in the sense of, like, if you look at, and this is partly in the book itself, if you look, in 2012, if you compare 2012 to, say, like 1972 or 1982, 1992, whatever, government was bigger, it spent more money, it regulated more things. and yet somehow we had become freer because in all of these places that politics couldn't control or regulate very well, people became freer. We had more stuff. People owned more cars. People had more TVs or more screens. Individually, people, either through custom or through legal changes, you could, if you were gay, you could actually be out and proud, and you could get married and things like that. People more freely use drugs, even if they were illegal. So, that's the case for optimism, which is that politics is a lagging indicator of where society is already headed. Um, but it's also pessimistic because there's no question that the government gets bigger. The size, scope, and spending of government keeps getting bigger compared to now. I mean, it almost is quaint. Just 3 years ago or 2 years ago, government was spending maybe $4.8 trillion a year. We spent in the past 12 months, we spent over $6 trillion on COVID relief alone, and there's more coming. So, in that sense, things are going in anything but a libertarian direction.
Can we
But
put
in Yes,
COVID relief in quotations?
yes, of course, because of it's not it had nothing to do or virtually nothing to do with actually helping people who either had were sick or preventing it or whatever. But it still is the case. I think that you know that there are a lot of places where politics is getting better when you look at something like the drug war, and this is not necessarily to say drugs. I mean, I believe drugs should be legal. I don't think everybody should necessarily use drugs or anything, but the drug war is breaking down, and that's a major part of government that is changing. Things like criminal justice reform is happening. There are a bunch of ways in which the police and law enforcement, when they're acting poorly, they're actually being held accountable. There are fewer wars than there used to be, which is a major thing. And that's like not a small improvement, that we're actually bombing and killing fewer people. Still too many, but it's going in the right direction. Things like occupational licensing, these are laws that are usually done at the state level, sometimes the local level, saying that in order to be a hairdresser, you have to do this, that, and the other thing, and you have to get a permission from the state. Those are being challenged and struck down in various ways. So there's a lot of positive growth, even as the size and the scope of government is getting bigger and bigger. And this is a real challenge, I think, for people in your generation and your age, because especially if you're libertarian, because the fact is that people today are much more comfortable with kind of big government than they were 10 years ago or 30 years ago. So that's a challenge. If you want to get people to really start flipping, sides, you've got your work cut out for you in a way that, is tougher than I did.
And the book also makes a really good case about how the most dysfunctional parts of American life are the parts that are touched by politics and government, like
Yeah.
public schools, Amtrak, healthcare, everything
Yeah.
basically.
Yeah,
The price goes
retirement, healthcare, and education, K through 12 education, especially. And, this is something where coming out of the pandemic, and there had already been movement towards school choice, where, the idea of letting individual students and their parents make, having more choices. And this, takes the form of, instead of making everybody go to the school that's in their neighborhood, giving people the equivalent of the amount of money that's being spent on education and saying, okay, you can go out and you can choose which school you want to go to. That injects a form of competition into education, which generally speaking means, when you have competition in a market, you get an increase in the quality and the quantity of the service or the good that's being provided. And and the price goes down. And we recognize this all the time when you go to supermarkets, when you go to restaurants, food gets cheaper and better because there is competition for the dollar of the customer. In places where you don't have that, where you have heavily protected markets, like in K through 12 education, where over 90% of people go to public schools, in healthcare, where 50 cents of every dollar in the healthcare system is spent by the government. There's not as much competition. There's not as many market forces. With retirement, most people's savings, are forced savings through payroll taxes for Social Security, which is a terrible retirement plan. It's not really a retirement plan, but it takes particularly lower income workers. They get taxed heavily for a retirement benefit that they don't really have any say over, and that is going to do much worse than if you had been kind of investing in mutual funds all along with the same amount of money.
And it's really surprising, especially like now when the private sector has created incredible companies with these
Yeah.
goods and services. You have Amazon, Facebook, Uber, Airbnb, you have like
Mm-hmm.
DoorDash, all this stuff.
Yeah.
And yet there are these people, me, like people my age, that have been raised on this like Reddit, like instant messaging, Instagram, all this
Mm-hmm.
stuff. You don't tolerate waiting in line to get anything, like you want it now. But
Right.
they're so willing to support big government. How does that make sense, I guess?
Yeah, it's so there's an economist who was very well known in his day, and he's still considered highly, named Joseph Schumpeter. And actually, you mentioned Deirdre McCloskey. She uses a lot of Schumpeter or Schumpeterian thought in her work. But Schumpeter is the guy who coined the term creative destruction, where he said, that a capitalist society, a free market society, generally, it really helps poor people more than wealthy people because it creates many more goods that at lower prices for people who are working class rather than for, kings and queens who could always afford the most expensive version of stuff. But Schumpeter also talked about that what capitalism does is that it tends to be so successful in creating wealth and kind of spreading it around that people take it for granted. And then people are uncomfortable. One of the things that happens in a free market society is that whole industries go in and out of existence, in a single person's lifetime or in a decade or something like that. And that is so disruptive that a lot of times people take for granted that we can just kind of dictate what we want and keep the system frozen in place and then kind of redistribute whatever exists in a fairer and fairer way. That doesn't work. That tends to freeze innovation and you end up being poorer over time. And I think we have gone through in the past, 10 years, 20 years, a lot of disruptions, because all sorts of innovative things are coming on market, and while we benefit from it, it also freaks us out. And an example of this would be before Uber or Lyft or a rideshare program, there were taxis. Taxis are extremely heavily regulated by the state, and meaning like the local government. So in places like Arlington, there are very few taxi cabs available because the city the city government has said there's only going to be this number of taxis. You can't hail them from the street. You have to call them up ahead of time, et cetera. A company like Uber and Lyft comes along and they come up with a way that, is just incredibly great at figuring out how to get affordable rides to people who want them, in a way that totally takes away market share from taxi cabs. And then, what people looking at that, they say, well, it's bad, that taxi cab drivers who have spent their whole life driving taxi cabs now can't compete against this. We're going to limit Uber and Lyft, or we're going to make it so that taxi cab drivers, stick around. And you can see how that stops innovation, and it comes out of, I think, a positive, sense of regard for people. You don't want people to be thrown out of work and like not be able to make a living. But if that's the only thing that you focus on, then you're destroying all of the kinds of innovations that make our lives better. If cell phones took away market share from old landlines. I don't know if you've even ever used a landline. But like, this is change happens because we want different things over time, and people come up with better ways of giving us what we want. Sometimes we don't even know that we want something until it's invented. And that's very disruptive. And I think a lot of people now are wealthy. We're, much wealthier than we were 50 years ago as a society, and we don't like that disruption. But then in seeking to keep that disruption from happening, we end up actually creating a world which can't really, adapt and grow and innovate and become richer. So it's a real dichotomy.
It's I don't know. I feel like people are kind of scared in a way.
Yeah. Well, there's so much unknown in the world, right? I mean, like, we had starting, in the early 21st century, we had kind of global terrorism in a way that in America, at least, had never really been experienced. People got scared about that. We have an economic, a major economic recession in the 2007, 2008, 2009, mostly because of government policies, attempts to kind of regulate the housing market and keep prices up, and a variety of other things related to that. But there's a huge crash. And when there is that kind of disruption, people look for stability and they expect the government to provide everything, or they want that. And it's an understandable impulse, but it's something we need to talk about, and we need to figure out a way, I think, where we allow creative destruction to happen, because that's where everything new and good comes from. That's where electric guitars come from, which were hated, and that's where radio came from and was hated. And then the next iteration, of Spotify, which is hated, et cetera. Like, we need to be able to allow for creative destruction, make people understand why it's happening. And then I think this is the role of government, really, is to help people who are dislocated by changes in technology or culture, and things like that, to help them move from, where they were to where they need to be in order to flourish. And our safety net programs don't really do a very good job of that. So we need to have better programs that actually work to help people learn how to live with change and to adapt to change over time.
In the book, you say that, quote, we need independence in politics and from politics,
Mm-hmm.
end quote, which I don't know. This is kind of what I think about when I'm thinking about all of this and what people think about government, the wants that they have in relation to what they think the government should do. And
Right.
it astonishes me because it seems like the opposite of what's happening, where people are putting politics in the center of their lives. I mean, I had a
Yeah.
friend who, when Biden was elected, told me they stopped watching and reading the news because they knew the country was in good hands. And that first made me laugh and cry a little bit. But so I don't know, just can you talk about that a little bit? And like, yeah.
Yeah, well, and the reason why we need independence in politics is because if you just become a team player, you're going to end up, on the Republican side, you're going to end up defying reality, and in the current moment saying, oh well, you know what, the election was stolen from Donald Trump, and like you if you're going to be a team player, and you're a Republican, you're defying reality. You have to sign on to a bunch of stuff that is just kind of nuts. Or if you're a Democrat, it means that you're going to sign on to something like the Green New Deal, and an expansion of government, into every corner of life, and without raising taxes to pay for this kind of stuff, taking out more and more loans that will be paid off by people down the road in the future. By being an independent in politics, you will force politicians and political parties to be more responsible and more tempered and more realistic, I think, in what they say they can do and how they act. And that's a good thing. But then more importantly, we do need this, I think, an independence from politics. And this is a libertarian insight, which is that, are the places where our lives get better and better are not in things that we're going to be voting on, as much as in building the worlds and the communities that we want to live, the companies, that make life so much richer and better. Uber and Lyft have done more to help people get around, or things like Bird scooters, and Lime and stuff like that. Those have had a better effect on our lives than all of the public transportation systems that people are constantly saying we need, and things like that. you want independence from politics, because when you're outside of the world of politics, you have more options. And it's not like one side wins and forces the other side to live the way they want. You can either use Uber or not. You can use Lime or Bird scooters or not, and things like that. And so if we make politics the center of our life, then every election, every 2 years, every 4 years, every annual election, there are going to be such brutal winners and losers that people will be at each other's throats all the time. It's so much better to live in a world that is beyond politics or before politics, where we're just trying to figure out how, in a voluntary way, how do we build the best business? How do we build the best church? How do we build the best school? Where, we get people not because they're forced to come to us, but because they want to come to us. How do we attract people and build the world that we want to live in?
And I don't know, for me, it's just kind of a silly notion because it's, as you were saying with the bundle idea, I really, every time someone is elected, I'm like, okay, maybe one or two okay things are going to happen,
Mm-hmm.
but like, I don't really agree with anything else. And so it's just, I feel like if I was and if independence threw an entire like fit every single time that someone
Mm-hmm.
they didn't like was elected, we would just have like war all the time. It would just not, I don't know. Yeah.
Well, that is also, by the way, that's kind of happening. And I think we go into it in the book, but even in the first decade or so of the 21st century, there were historically high rates of where the White House or the House of Representatives or the Senate would flip control from Democratic to Republican. That is completely continued, since in the decade since the book was first published. And there is every reason to believe like the parties do not represent large swaths of people. They get into power, they're extreme and unappealing. They win elections because they're the only game in town, and they rig the system so that third parties really can't compete. They get into power, they push their agenda, which is unappealing to people, and they get voted out of power in 2 years, in 4 years, or in 6 years. That continually happens. The Democrats, that we voted out, or, Donald Trump was voted out of office as president, but the Republicans actually gained seats in the House. The Democrats took the Senate. In the next elections, in 2022, it's almost certain that the Republicans will actually take control of the House because the Democrats aren't that popular. They may take control back of the Senate. Biden will stay in office, but they are not appealing to broad consensus of voters. And as a result, we just keep flipping back and forth because they're not offering things. They're not offering a bundle that gives them a majority that lasts more than a couple of years. They should be getting that message, but they don't have to because of the way politics is structured, where, they get to be in power and they get to throw money around, whether they win by one vote or by, a million votes.
Thank you so much, Nick. I had such a
Mm.
good time and I learned a ton. So time for the final question.
Yes.
What is one thing you believed at one time in your life that you later changed your position on, and why?
I think a big part of it is that when I started thinking about public policy, I thought that there were like that smart people could come up with really good solutions. And especially when it came to helping, lower income people, people with fewer resources, that they needed to be guided, so that it would make sense, say, for people under the poverty line, which is, it means people who are very poor, that you wouldn't want to just give them money and, so then they weren't poor anymore, but you would want to give it to them in the form of a education voucher, a healthcare voucher, or a housing voucher or something like that, and restrict how they could spend it. Over time, I've come to believe that probably introduces more problems than it solves, and that it's better to give people at every level more control over their lives. And so when it comes to public policy, and particularly for poverty programs, it would be much better to just give somebody who's poor, let's say they're $5,000 below the poverty line, instead of giving them a bunch of coupons that allow them to buy this under this circumstance or this over here and whatever, just give them the $5,000 and check in on them and help them and give them more resources to make wise decisions, but give them more power over their lives. I think that, and that took a while to sink in for me, but I think, it will work better.
I think I get that. I mean, the way I've always thought of it, I guess, because I'm young, is like receiving an allowance, but being like, you can only buy history books, and then being like, but I want to read science fiction, and
Right.
not being allowed to. And I mean, that never really happened to that extent with me as a child, but I feel like I've always kind of understood that idea of like, you give them money, it's theirs to spend on what they want and need, because their needs are not the same as yours or what you think
Yeah.
is best for them necessarily.
And
So,
this comes from, a recognition on a kind of philosophical level. A lot of libertarianism is tied to individualism and kind of subjective, what Austrian school economists would call the subjective theory of value, which is that we, have different value systems where we want certain things more than others, and that a system works better both politically but economically and culturally as well when people are able to actually kind of pursue what they find more valuable or what they think is a higher priority. It's conferring on people a lot of respect and autonomy and dignity. And it not only is philosophically or morally good, I think it ends up creating a better functioning system as well.
yeah. Thank you so much. I had such a good time, and yeah.
All right. Well, thank you very much. It's a real honor and a privilege.
Well, that's all we have time for today. I'd like to thank my guest once again for their time and insight. I would also like to thank everyone who listens, subscribes, and shares the Great Antidote podcast. If you would like to be on the podcast, or if you have a guest in mind, please feel free to reach out to me at thegreatantidote@thecgo.org. Bye.